All right, well, good morning. Why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started for today? And so it is Monday. It is the fourth day of March, 2020. May the fourth be with you if you are into that Star Wars sort of a thing. And today we're going to go ahead and do a couple of things. Main thing is to go ahead and get into talking about some of the highlights in the class notes that I have for you on Canvas for the chapter, the subject that you are learning about right now. That is dealing with liberalism and the beginnings of a serious decline in the centrality of the political within philosophy itself. Specifically, we're going to talk about the fact that beginning with a variety of what we refer to now as being classical liberal philosophers like John Locke and Adam Smith and people like that, that essentially politics takes on a new meaning, that politics goes from being essentially an independent variable in understanding what is going on in society to much more of a dependent variable. Specifically, politics becomes sublimated, kind of subsumed into larger considerations of society in general. So this is a trend that begins with the classical liberals and begins to grow in the next section that we'll be learning about and that I'll be talking about during next week's Zoom meeting, which will deal with a period, a historical period known as the Age of Organization, where we see politics further kind of, sinking down and becoming of less and less importance in the overall scheme of understanding society. So that pretty much is what we're going to be talking about starting today. Before we do any of that, though, just a few announcements and reminders. The first one being, of course, that if you still have not yet completed and submitted to me your second test of the semester, please do send me an email or a Canvas message or come and talk to me during my virtual student hours. The next one of those, of course, is this afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and the Zoom link and password for those virtual student hours can be found on our Canvas homepage for this class. If you scroll down past the picture to the basic course information section, you can find that link and password. But anyway, however you do it, communicate with me. Let's figure out a solution so that you can get test number 2 submitted to me and you can move forward and continue to be successful in the class. So that's the first thing to mention. Also, of course, the next of your discussion forum post assignments that is due is coming up this Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., not counting, of course, the 3-day grace period that is connected with all of our assignments in this class this semester. And that is the discussion forum post dealing with Hobbes and science. And we talked about Hobbes quite a bit last week. It was the main topic. In just a minute, before we get into talking about the classical liberals, I will deal with any questions or comments that you have about Hobbes, any last minute things while you are working on that Hobbes and science discussion forum post for this Wednesday. And of course, the discussion forum post related to classical liberalism that we'll be talking about today, that is due a week from this coming Wednesday. That is May 13th at 11:59 p.m. And again, with the 3-day grace period tacked onto that assignment as well. So that's just some announcements and reminders. Let me also remind you, of course, that this meeting is being recorded, as all of our weekly Zoom meetings are, so that if you want to take a look at all or part of this meeting going forward, you can go ahead and access this recording and any other previous Zoom meeting that we have recorded. That's available via the ConferZoom link on the in the left-hand margin of our Canvas homepage. Click on ConferZoom. Then once you get there, click on Recordings. And when you click on the recording for this particular day, Zoom may or may not prompt you for a password. If it does, the password is the same one that you use to access this meeting today. The same password that I gave you in the Canvas announcement that I sent you for this meeting this past Friday. So always feel free to review our past Zoom meetings in case, there's something that we talked about still not quite making sense, that sort of thing. And obviously, for anything that I can help you with, whether it's regarding material in this class, regarding an assignment in this class, or anything that you think that I can assist you with, even if it has nothing to do with LBCC or political philosophy or anything like that, please do feel free to reach out to me. And as I mentioned previously, there's a number of ways that you can do that. You can send me an email, you can send me a Canvas message, you can stop by during my virtual student hours, again on Zoom, Monday and Wednesday afternoons, 2:30 to 3:30 Pacific Daylight Time. And if you want to meet one-on-one with me via Zoom, but you're unable to make it to the student hours on Monday and Wednesday afternoons, just send me an email, send me a Canvas message, and we can work out. I can set up an individual one-on-one Zoom appointment for us, and we can talk about whatever you need for us to talk about. So please don't hesitate to reach out at any time. Because remember, I'm here for you, not just for purposes of this class, but for purposes of us just getting through this crazy period in our lives that we are having to get through. So before we do anything else, are there any questions about anything having to do with the class in general before we move forward? And for questions or comments throughout the hour today, as always, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask your question or make your comment, or if you would prefer, you can go ahead and put your question or your comment in the group chat, and that will work out just fine. All right, so any questions or comments, problems, whatever, before we do anything else today? Anybody? Okay, very good. So if you just give me 1 second, because I realized I didn't pop up one window that I needed to pop up. Last week, we spent most of the hour talking a little bit about political philosophy and Thomas Hobbes. We talked about Hobbes's rather unique scientific approach to political philosophy. The fact that as time went on, Hobbes really tried to take a mathematical approach, more specifically an approach based on Euclidean geometry. And remember, Hobbes was trying to figure out how one could create what Wolin refers to as an eternal constitution. That is a constitution that will effectively govern a particular society for an indefinite period of time. And remember, we emphasized the fact last week in talking about Hobbes and his political philosophy that he was very much influenced in his thinking by the really rather chaotic situation that Hobbes was living through in his native England. England was amidst at a period of civil war at the time. The Civil War became so extreme and Hobbes felt so threatened that he eventually had to escape to France to avoid persecution or because of his fear of possible persecution. And so all of this had this really, deep impact on his thinking. And you can see why this would fuel his deep desire to be able to discover the ideal framework or template for government that could be built into this so-called eternal constitution. And obviously, the chaos that Hobbes had to escape from leaving his native England also helps to explain why Hobbes believed that any long-lasting, effective government would have to be extremely sovereign, that is independent, meaning that it did not owe its existence to anyone or anything else in society, and that that sovereign would have to be extremely strong, that it would have to be able to sometimes break some heads, essentially, to be able to effectively maintain order in society and keep things under control. Now, related to that, of course, we also talked last week about how Hobbes, kind of the basis for all of this eternal constitution and powerful sovereign government stuff that Hobbes was interested in. We talked about his most famous thought experiment, the one that served as the basis of his masterwork, Leviathan, and that was this concept of the state of nature. And really, Hobbes's idea of what government or what society or what the world must have been like in the absence of any sort of organized society or government, even tribe, his concept of the very self-interested, brutal, dangerous state of nature really helps us understand what Hobbes saw as being the origin of the chaos that was happening in the contemporary England of his time, and also fueled the need to develop this very strong sovereign government ensconced in this hopefully eternal constitution. So those were some of the major points that we hit last week in our discussion of Hobbes. So hopefully since then, you've had a chance to do all of the reading in Wolin in chapter 8. You've taken a look at the pages in Political Philosophy, a graphic guide dealing with Hobbes. And hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the video that I put up for you on our in the Canvas module on Hobbes. At this point, are there any questions, comments, problems relating to Hobbes and his political philosophy that we should address before we go ahead and move on, talking about our main topic for today, which is the rise of classical liberalism, particularly as defined by the political philosophy of John Locke? So any leftover questions, comments, problems about Hobbes? And again, feel free to unmute your mic or put something in the group chat. Okay, so got a question relating not to Hobbes, but to the class in general. Is the Student's Choice Project still due on May 20th, or has it been extended? And the question is, the answer is the due date is still the due date. So, and obviously, though, the 3-day grace period also applies to the Student's Choice Project as it does for every other assignment in this class. And the reason why I am not planning on extending the due date for the Student's Choice Project is not to be mean or difficult or anything like that. But the thing is, it is going to take me a little while to go through and carefully read and evaluate and assess your projects. And I want to be able to make sure that I get the grades for that project posted as soon as possible. And so if I extend the due date much further, that's going to make it a really complicated job of me getting everything graded by the time that I need to get it graded for. And it's also going to interfere with your ability to work on and get test number 3 that's due at the very end of the semester submitted as well. So the Student's Choice Project due date is still the due date. Now remember, in case you haven't looked at the Student's Choice Project guidelines in a while, I have gone ahead and decreased the minimum page number for the project. I've given you some additional options for the project. And here's the thing, if you realize at some point as you're working on this that you're not going to be able to make either the due date for the project, or you're not, more important, that you're not going to be able to turn in the project by the end of the 3-day grace period, so you won't be able to get it in by 11:59 p.m. on May 23rd, just send me an email, send me a Canvas message, stop by my virtual student hours. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out a solution that works for everybody. But the due date is still the due date. Okay. So any other questions about Hobbes specifically, or about anything else having to do with the class before we go ahead and move forward and talk a little bit about classical liberalism? Anybody? Caffeine especially important on Monday mornings, obviously. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. And as I said, really kind of the key, and hopefully you have pulled up on whatever device you have handy, or you have a hard copy of the notes that I posted for you in the Canvas module for liberalism relating to chapter 9 in your Wolin book. And hopefully you have your Wolin book handy, just in case you need it as well. As I was saying, at the opening of the class today, really, as we move into, and Hobbes is, most people don't consider Hobbes to be a classical liberal philosopher, though he certainly is on the cusp of it. I think that Hobbes is kind of a needed, almost developmental step, or evolutionary step, if you will, between the political philosophy of folks like Machiavelli and the classical liberal folks like Locke and Smith and others that we're going to talk a little bit about today. So as I said, really kind of the main characteristic, the main distinction of classical liberal philosophy that Wolin really wants to emphasize for us in chapter 9 of his book is the fact that essentially political philosophy beginning in the classical liberal period really goes into a period of decline. And it's really important that we understand what we mean, or what Wolin means when he talks about liberalism and the decline of political philosophy. Now, when he talks about the decline of political philosophy, he's not saying that political philosophy of this period is unimportant, is immaterial, that we don't need to pay attention to it or understand it. That is not what he's saying. Instead, what he's saying is that, especially beginning with the classical liberal philosophers and kind of bleeding over into the following period known as the Age of Organization, which we'll talk more about next Monday morning, that political philosophical considerations become less important for those trying to understand how and why society works in the way that it does. So basically what Wolin means when he talks about the supposed decline of political philosophy starting in the classical liberal period is that beginning with folks like Locke and Smith and some of the others that he talks about, Montesquieu and Edmund Burke and Auguste Comte and folks like that, is that political considerations, governmental considerations, as an overall piece of understanding how societies function and how societies evolve over time, that politics moves from being an independent variable, essentially, to being a dependent variable. In other words, politics and political philosophy is not the driving force, is not the main influence that's impacting and influencing and changing societies. Instead, we're saying that society itself and other important forces that are moving in society, such as economics, those are in fact now impacting government, impacting politics. So political philosophy is not the independent variable anymore. It's not the X variable anymore. It's not influencing other stuff going on in society. Instead, politics and political philosophy is now the dependent variable. It is the why variable. It itself is being impacted by other social, economic, and cultural forces in society. And this represents the biggest change, the biggest transition that starts in this classical liberal period. And again, that's what Wolin is trying to get at when he talks about the decline of political philosophy in this period. So does that make sense to us so far? Questions, comments, problems, complaints about this understanding of political philosophy moving from being an independent variable to a dependent variable, essentially, with the classical liberal philosophers. So questions, comments, problems, either verbally or via the group chat. Is this making sense to us so far on the Monday morning? And you know what might be helpful is notice if you look in the if you pop up the window in Canvas, kind of the participant window, you do have buttons below the list of participants. You have specifically a yes or a no button. So if I ask for questions, if you don't have a question, or if I say, is everybody understanding, or whatever it is, you might want to make use of the yes or no buttons, just so I can get a bit of an affirmation one way or another, which I see some people are doing now. Okay, so that's great. So last chance, any questions about this first element of classical liberal philosophy? Okay, great. So let's go ahead and move on, and let's start working our way through some of the highlights, talking a little bit about classical liberalism. And to an extent, we've already started talking a little bit about some of the stuff in section Roman numeral number 2 of your notes. As you see there in Roman numeral number 2, I mentioned the key point of the chapter for Locke and the classical liberals. Politics is, and I quote directly from Wolin here on page 258, politics is a, quote, derivative form of activity, unquote, meaning that it is not, left out a word there, meaning that it is not, sorry about that, I'll have to fix that typo, an independent realm of activity or study in itself. It does not hold absolute truths unique unto itself. Instead, it is submerged in the larger realm of society. Now, and we've already talked about that. Now, to build on that point a little bit, though, if you take a look at point capital A in section Roman numeral number 2, notice that as we move through chapter 9, in the early stages of the chapter, Wolin attempts to draw a distinction. He tends to divide the major classical liberal philosophers of the period into two main groups. Now, here's the thing. Both sets of these classical liberal philosophers, all of them see the realm of politics and political philosophy as being, you know, subsidiary to everything else going on in society. They see politics and political philosophy as being an independent variable. But the distinction that Wolin tries to develop between these two groups in the early pages of chapter 9 is to show that they have slightly different takes on the actual role of politics in society, the actual influence of political philosophy. So for example, if you look at point 1 under capital A, the first group that Wolin talks about, starting on page 261, are a group of political philosophers, a couple of whom were very important and very influential on the thinking of folks like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, and other folks at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, meaning the folks who would write our current US Constitution. if you've taken Poli-Sci 1, you know that most of the folks at the Philadelphia Convention, most of the authors of our current Constitution, who I like to refer to as the framers of the Constitution, most of the framers were primarily and fundamentally influenced by classical liberal political philosophers, like the ones that we are talking about in this section. And Montesquieu, the French political philosopher, and another French political philosopher, Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, folks in this first group were very, very important in the thinking of the framers as they were creating our current US Constitution for different reasons. Montesquieu was important because his writings provided a very important structural piece for the framers as they were creating our current US Constitution, specifically as they were creating the national government within our current US Constitution. Now, if you've taken Poli-Sci 1, and especially if you've been victimized by me, either in Poli-Sci 1 or in Poli-Sci 1H, you know the importance of Montesquieu. Because when I talk about this in 1 and 1H, one of the things that I mention in discussing our current Constitution is that in creating this document in 1787, the framers had two major things that they were trying to accomplish on top of all the other objectives that they had in creating this new governmental system for the United States. One of their two main objectives in creating our current Constitution was to try and figure out how they could create a national government for the United States that was both strong enough to maintain order in society, but also not so strong that it threatens the people's natural rights, that a government can become so strong that it can take away people's basic freedoms. And the reason why this was such a dilemma for the framers, and the reason why this was such a high priority for the framers, just in case you haven't taken me for 1 or 1H, is the fact that the framers wanted to avoid the extremes of government that they didn't think worked very well and that they had already experienced in earlier parts of their lives. So, for example, on the one hand, they didn't want the new national government under the Constitution to be so strong that they could just step on people's freedoms and take them away for no good reason. So they didn't want the national government of the United States to be like the national government of Great Britain, which they had to live under during the colonial period leading to the American Revolution. They didn't like that extreme at all. But on the other hand, they also wanted to make sure that this new national government that they were creating was not so weak that it wasn't able to maintain order in society. They didn't want American society to be able to have to melt down into chaos, because that was what they were living through in 1787. Because our country's first constitution was an absolute disaster. This constitution known as the Articles of Confederation. Now, why was it a failure? Because the folks who wrote it, most of whom who write our current Constitution, made a big mistake with the Articles of Confederation. They were so scared of creating an overly powerful national government like the British that they went too far the other way, create a national government so weak that it couldn't even maintain order in American society. And American society nearly melted down into riots, rebellion, and chaos in 1786. So you see what the framers were trying to do. How do you avoid either extreme of government? Because neither of them really works. Montesquieu provides them with part of the solution. The framers borrow an important structural element of government that Montesquieu pioneered, known as separation of powers. And if you've taken Poli-Sci 1 or 1H with pretty much anybody, you know what separation of powers is. Separation of powers is when you make sure that no one in the national government has more than one of the three most basic powers of government. So separate groups of people within the national government make the laws, that's Congress. A second group enforces the laws, that's the executive branch led by the president. And a third group within the national government interprets the laws, tells us what the laws mean. That's the courts, the judicial branch, right? So Montesquieu said, look, if you divide your national government in this way, and you make sure that nobody in the national government has control over more than one of these three basic types of authority, then you probably will have a government that is strong enough, but not too strong. So the framers were all over that, and that's why Montesquieu's notion of separation of powers ends up in the Constitution itself. So very influential. And Alexis de Tocqueville, another Frenchman, lived and traveled in the US for a number of years and wrote a very famous work that really kind of defines the early developing political culture of the United States called Democracy in America. And we still frequently cite Montesquieu today. So these folks formed one group of these classical liberals. And look how Wolin describes this group on page 261. He says, basically, they're a very divergent group, meaning they have a lot of different ideas amongst themselves, but they agree on one major thing. What they agree on is that the authority of political institutions, in other words, the authority of folks like the president, Congress, or the courts in the American context, was founded upon a wide variety of social authorities and was fed by a variety of private loyalties. Now, that's a very fancy, a very Wolin-ish way of saying a pretty simple but important thing. What Wolin is saying is that people obey the law. People in society do what government tells them to do, not because they're afraid of government, dropping the iron fist on them or something like that. But instead, people do what government tells them to do. They obey governmental institutions because it is in their interest to do so. That other aspects of their social lives in society makes it in their interest to do what government says. Or that they believe in their minds, in their thoughts, in their hearts, whatever, that obeying government, that following what the political authorities tell them is the right thing to do. So that is the take of this group on how social authority is the independent variable and government and politics is the dependent variable. So does that make sense to us so far? If not, ask me a question, put a question in the group chat, or if it does make sense to you, please click on the yes button, the green check mark button, and let me know. Does that make sense to us? Any questions? Don't be afraid to ask. Lovely. Okay, so that's one group, right? And I got some thumbs up as well. I appreciate that. That's another way of letting me know too. So now the other group of classical liberals also believe that politics is the dependent variable, society is the independent variable, but they have a slightly different take, a slightly different interpretation on the issue than do Montesquieu and Burke and Comte and Tocqueville and the other folks in the first group. So if you look at point 2 under capital A, we're talking about another important group of philosophers, especially John Locke. Because again, if you've taken Poli-Sci 1 or Poli-Sci 1H, you know that the framers, the folks who wrote our current Constitution, were just obsessed in general with the writing and thinking of John Locke, particularly Locke's conception of natural rights. this revolutionary idea, at least at the time of the framers, that all human beings are given certain basic freedoms by God, by their creator, that nobody else should be able to take away from them. And Locke said 3 examples of those God-given fundamental unbreakable natural rights are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to own property. Now, if that sounds kind of familiar, but not quite, the concept of natural rights becomes such an important part of the American Revolution, the move for American independence in the years leading up to and including 1776, that Thomas Jefferson, when he writes the Declaration of Independence, basically plagiarizes John Locke. And he gets away with it, right? He basically says to the world, okay, folks, here's why the 13 formerly British colonies are revolting, breaking away, seeking independence from the British government. It is because the British government is unfairly, unreasonably, and without any reasonable justification taking away our basic freedoms, taking away our God-given natural rights. Now, when Jefferson talks about this in the Declaration, he goes with Locke to some extent on what the major, most important natural rights are. He says life, liberty, like Locke does, but he doesn't specifically mention property, the right to own property in the Declaration. He says instead, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And Wolin talks about this later in the chapter, right? This idea of the pursuit of happiness, how it relates to our contemporary understanding of a major part of American political culture that we talked about at the beginning of the semester when we were still face-to-face, called the American Dream. And remember, all of that is part of the discussion forum post for Locke and the classical liberals that you'll be working on. Some of you have already done that for this week. The pursuit of happiness. Classical liberals like Jefferson and like Locke see happiness in a very different way than we do today. And I talk a little bit about that further down in the class notes for this section. Specifically, if you take a look at the very end of the notes, points capital E, well, really points capital D, E, and then kind of culminating in point capital F. And hopefully we'll have time to get there towards the end. Wolin talks about all this stuff on pages 290 and 291, in case we don't get a chance to talk about it extensively together this morning. So Locke, really important thinker for the framers. Not because, well, besides natural rights, Locke ends up being important in the thinking of the framers because Locke speaks a lot, and I mentioned this further along in the notes too. Locke talks a lot about human nature. Locke talks a lot about the condition of human beings generally in the world. And as you will see from the reading, as you will see from the notes, Locke and most other classical liberal philosophers had a very pessimistic, very rather dismal and negative and kind of depressing view of human nature. Well, I mean, look at if you skip down to point Roman numeral number 3, look at capital A, Locke's mediocre view of man. Locke had confined men to a middling sort of condition, incapable of omniscience or perfection. Quote, a state of mediocrity, which is not capable of extremes, unquote. Locke just didn't think much of people. Locke thought that most human beings were kind of stupid, kind of selfish, kind of self-involved, not very reflective, kind of materialistic, that sort of thing, kind of narcissistic. It's not a very positive view of who we are as people, right? But the reason why that's important is because the framers, the folks who designed our governmental system in the United States, the folks who wrote the US Constitution, completely bought into Locke's mediocre conception of people. And that's why our government looks the way it does. That's why originally the upper house of Congress, the Senate, was not elected by voters, but was appointed by state government officials. That's why even today, technically speaking, the ordinary American voter does not choose the president of the United States. Instead, a group of people, supposedly elite people, though they aren't so elite anymore, called the Electoral College, make the selection on behalf of the people. That's why the framers were scared of giving us too much power, giving we the people too much authority over what government does. They were afraid of too much democracy. Why? Because they didn't trust us. And they so bought into Locke's dismal conception of human nature, they didn't even trust a lot of elites in American society at the time. They didn't even trust a lot of people like themselves. So Locke is just incredibly important to understanding why our current US Constitution says what it says and does what it does. Now, if you jump back up to point capital B under 2, or pardon me, no, if you jump up to point 2 under capital A, sorry about that, talking about Locke, the classical economists, the French liberals, and English utilitarians, Wolin talks about this. He says, gradually, they believed that society came to be known as an entity distinct from the political and the source of all worthwhile human endeavor, while the political became identified with a narrow set of institutional arrangements known as government. So in other words, this group really had even less regard for government than did the folks in the first group, Montesquieu and Burke and people like that. Folks like Locke and these other folks really had what we would call an instrumental view of government. Government plays a role in society that is very, very limited. Government is nothing more than a useful tool to try and provide basic services to society, to maintain order in society, to prevent things from blowing up into chaos. But that's it. That government plays this really limited role in society. It's a tool. It's one tool among many that we use to have a good, productive, effective society, okay? So this gives you an idea. You know, government serves its purposes according to Locke and others, but its purposes are very narrowly framed. Its purposes are very limited, okay? And that's why, by the way, the framers were so worried as they created our current Constitution to make sure that both the national government of the United States and the then 13 state governments in the United States had enough power to do what they needed to do to carry out their basic but limited functions in society, but that they also did not have too much power, too much influence over what goes on in society. So does that make sense? Any questions about this second group of classical liberal philosophers? So if you have a question, please go ahead and ask either vocally or in the group chat. If you have no questions, just hit the no button on your participant screen. So any questions at all before we move on? Okay, great. Thank you. So, here's the thing, right? And let's kind of go back because we already kind of skipped down a little bit. Um, let's skip down there just a little farther though. Look at point 2 under capital A. Or specifically look at point capital B there under 2. That section labeled contemporary connections. I wanted to mention this briefly because I want you to kind of think about this as you go through this section of the material. Look what it says there. I give you a specific quote from Wolin on page 262. And I'm wondering, and I want you to think about whether or not what Wolin is saying in this quote from 262 is still valid, is still an accurate reflection of kind of how we think about government and society in the US in the present day period. Because remember, Wolin originally wrote his book for the first time back in 1960. So the first edition of this massive thing was written in 1960. The more recent revision was in 2014, the one that we are working with this semester. But I'm wondering if this is true even now in 2020. Look what it says there. Wolin says on page 262, the decline of political categories and the ascendancy or the rise of social ones are the distinguishing marks of our contemporary situation. Now, I buy that. That's still true, right? Where political philosophy has been eclipsed by other forms of knowledge. And here's the part that I'm wondering about. Listen to this sentence, and maybe we can talk about this for a couple of minutes. Wolin goes on to say on 262, in the present age, we naturally turn to the sociologists or economists to supply prescriptions for society's ills. So in other words, what Wolin is saying is that the American people today, if there are problems in American society and we, the people, are looking for workable solutions to these problems, that we are not so much listening to political scientists or political philosophers or historians or maybe even elected officials, but instead we, the American people today, are looking to other social scientists like sociologists, and maybe also looking especially at economists, economic thinkers, economic theorists, to help us understand the problems that we are facing in society and what some workable solutions might be to some of those problems. What do you think about that? Do you think that's true? Wolin thought it was valid in 1960. He also thought it was a valid statement in 2014. But what about now in 2020? Because I really wonder about this. I think about this. This is one of the many things that keeps me awake at night. Seriously, I think about this a lot. Do you think the average American today, when trying to figure out solutions to our problems in this country, and boy, do we have some big problems in society right now, right? Do you think the average American is looking to what sociologists say? You know, they're looking at famous sociologists from famous universities in the US and elsewhere, you know, for solutions. Do you think that we're listening to what the economists are saying to figure out what's going on? Or do you think we're looking elsewhere? Who wants to sound off on this? I see a couple of comments in the group chat. For example, Crystal says, I absolutely agree that we look elsewhere. So if we're not looking at elected officials, if we're not looking at sociologists, if we're not looking at economists today for solutions to our problems, who are we looking at? Now, I have another comment that was sent to me privately, says that I think that it's true, but only to an extent. An example, this would be people wanting to reopen the government out of fear to stop a recession. So yeah, in that thing, talking about the current, one of the many debates that we are currently dealing with in American society today, dealing with COVID-19, is this debate, and some people are cloaking it as a freedom versus order thing, as a natural rights thing. Notice some of the protesters recently, but there also is an economic dimension to it as well. Because let's face it, the economy has taken a big dump in the 6 weeks or so that, we've been sheltering in place here in California and in a lot of other parts of the country. Unemployment is over 20% nationally right now, when it was like around 3%. Historically low levels before we got into all of this. So many small businesses have had to close their doors, have had to shut down permanently because don't have any money coming in during this crisis. Large corporations are having trouble. So yeah, if we're having this debate about how and when and how quickly we reopen the economy through this whole COVID-19 thing, obviously a lot of us are listening to what economists are saying, but not all of us, right? And this really represents a very serious dilemma, and really one of the biggest ongoing dilemmas that we are facing in this current crisis. So Crystal says in the group chat, definitely feel that we're provoked into considering the welfare of the economy rather than ourselves and our own safety and well-being. And that's a really interesting thing, because some people in society are suggesting that we have to make a rather uncomfortable trade-off, a potentially deadly trade-off for some of us. Some people are saying, look, the economy is in such desperate circumstances, and so many individuals' personal economies have been so devastated by our sheltering in place that we got to start reopening the economy sooner rather than later, and more quickly than a lot of elected officials are talking about wanting to do. And they're saying, look, that means that more people are going to catch this thing and more people are going to die. But you know what? That's necessary. Okay. And you're right. Sarah just came in on the group chat, and thank you, folks. I really love this. You're keeping up with these issues, obviously, and you see the relevance, the connections. Sarah just said in the group chat, yes, and there's also been the argument that economists are saying reopening and having more infections would be worse in the long run. Yeah, a number of very prominent economists are arguing that we would be made worse off economically if we reopened the economy too quickly and had an immense second wave of COVID-19 infections. That we might be better off economically if we, stay shut down for a longer period of time, and that we reopen very carefully and only when we can reasonably do so without causing new infections to skyrocket. So you see the problem here? Economists don't even agree on this issue. So this is a really tough one. And what makes it even more tough is that some folks have kind of merged the economic argument that we have to start bringing the economy back if we're going to survive. Some people, some of the protesters that you see in Sacramento, Huntington Beach, downtown LA, San Clemente, other cities across the country, some protesters are also bringing in the idea of natural rights, another classical liberal concept, a specifically Lockean concept, right? And they're saying, look, and there's one image, and unfortunately I don't have it handy. I think next semester in Poli-Sci 11, this one picture that I saw from a protest, I don't remember where the protest was. It was a sign painted on the back of a car. And I think I'm going to use it as a discussion forum post assignment for this class for next semester, because what it says is that my liberties, so my freedoms, right? My natural rights, my liberties are more important than your health. Now think about that for a second, right? My liberties are more important than your health. So what that person is saying is, look, I'm more concerned by the fact that I've been stuck at home for too long, that I can't, go to a restaurant or go to a bar or go to the gym or congregate with my friends on the beach, that the government is unnecessarily taking away my freedom of movement, my personal liberty, which is a God-given natural right. And that, guess what? In my view, not me personally, but the person who wrote this on their car, what they're saying is, in my view, my freedom to do that is more important than your health. And kind of the subtext, the corollary of that argument is, look, if I choose to take the personal risks to go out and associate with other people and not maintain social distancing, and if I'm willing to take the risk of catching COVID-19 in order to be able to go out and do what I want to do, then I should be able to take that risk. And I'm more worried about my ability to do that than I'm worried about protecting your health. Crystal says in the group chat, they are obviously not considering the science, let alone understand the severity of this virus and or do not care. Yeah, those are all possibilities. It's interesting. I saw an interview the other day with a guy who owns a restaurant and a hostel in South Orange County in San Clemente. And he basically, in violation of state government orders on this, he reopened his restaurant, and not just for, takeout and contactless delivery. He opened up his sit-down restaurant, and I saw pictures of people eating there, not maintaining the 6-foot social distancing, doing all that stuff. And some quotes this guy was saying in this interview with the newspapers, he said, look, this disease, the danger of this disease is being overblown by folks in the media. And he says, besides, temperatures, it has gotten so hot that this disease is going to die out. It's not going to continue to spread. It's challenging, right? Gabriel on the group chat says, I think it's meant as in, quote, I care more about my freedom than my health, like saying if that person wants to take the risk of catching it, then it's their business. If someone else doesn't want to take that risk, then they can stay at home. But see, here's the problem. Because the counter argument to that, okay, and I'm just kind of putting it out there as a counter argument, is that the whole reason behind these social distancing rules, for shutting down the economy, for doing all these things that we've done in so many parts of the country, is not because that if we do this for long enough, the disease will be eliminated, that people will stop catching it. That's not how it works. The idea is that you put all these rules into effect to try and slow the spread of the disease. It's this concept of flattening the curve, right? The idea here is you don't want so many people catching the disease at once that it overwhelms our health infrastructure, that hospitals become so overwhelmed that the healthcare system in the area collapses. And so I see the argument that you're stating, Gabriel. It's clear, but here's the thing. If enough people were to go ahead and violate these rules, and there's this massive spread of disease, sure, if people are going out and saying, well, it's my business, if I catch the disease, I take that risk for enhanced freedom, that should be my freedom, that should be my right. Well, that's true. But does your freedom extend to being able, if you and a bunch of other people out there catch the disease, the healthcare system becomes so overwhelmed that it collapses, then everybody in society is negatively affected by that, whether you are staying at home or not. So you see, that is the case. And Crystal says, if that is the case, then they should waive their freedom to seek medical attention. Theoretically, sure. But realistically, is that going to happen? Probably not. So you see how messy this is? And I think that this really nicely illustrates, what we're talking about here. And I realize we have gotten to 11 o'clock. One person's already jumped off. So let me go ahead and wrap this up really quickly. But what I think this, and I thank you all for your contributions, for your discussion on this. Because you all brought up great points on all the sides of this emerging controversial issue. But what this discussion really illustrates is exactly what the classical liberals are arguing, right? That if we're concerned about the well-being of society, we can't just be concerned with what government says and what government does, that there are all kinds of other significant variables that play a role. There is economic issues, other social issues, issues of public health, countless other factors. And so if we could somehow, dig up John Locke and reanimate him like in a horror movie and bring him back and have him look at the US or look at the world in 2020 and these issues, he'd probably say, see, that's exactly what I'm saying. Government is not an independent variable in situations like this or in any situation. It's one tool among many, and probably not even the most important tool at that. Does that make sense? Any remaining last-minute questions, comments, reactions about any of this before I wrap this up and end our meeting for this week? Anything at all? Questions, comments, whatever. Anyone? Okay, so remember, if you still have not submitted test number 2 to me via Canvas, send me an email, send me a Canvas message. Stop by during my virtual student hours. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out a solution. Remember, your discussion forum post dealing with Locke and the classical liberals is due this Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., plus the 3-day or 72-hour grace period tacked on after that. And so next week, I'll deal with any remaining questions. Next week I will be talking about the next section, getting into the age of organization. So have yourselves a great week. Thanks for joining me. I'm always here for you. And I just asked, so I'm always here for you for anything that you might need me for. Call me or email me, send me a text, or send me a Canvas message. You can tell I haven't had enough caffeine yet today. Stop by virtual student hours. We're going to get through this class successfully. We are going to get through this successfully, all of this together. You're not alone. I'm here for you. I've got your back. Take care. Be safe. Be well. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Okay. Okay. So It looks like it's just you and I, Miss Alvarado. So I was just responding to your private chat to me. So I can probably just tell you this. Here we are. Yeah, I agree with you. I would love to be able to take this to an hour and a half, 2 hours, that sort of thing. The reason why I don't is because, you know, when all of this thing started, we were advised, I was advised by my dean that as much as possible, we need to be able to maintain these classes, make them as asynchronous as possible, because it really is hard for people to get together at a regular time to go through and treat this class, you know, as we would if we were face to face. So that to do, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours of this would just be too much. And a lot of people just couldn't manage it with their rather crazy, out of control schedules during this crisis. So that's one reason why. Another reason is that there's all this research out there that indicates when we're doing this kind of learning, you know, virtually on Zoom or WebEx or something like that, that we tend to have shorter attention spans, and that once we start getting past an hour, people really kind of lose track of the discussion, lose interest, that sort of thing. So that's why I'm trying to keep this down to an hour per week. Now, if you want to talk more about this stuff, you can certainly meet with me during my virtual student hours, or if you would rather, if you want to set up a one-on-one Zoom appointment with me and we can go over some more of this stuff in more detail, I am happy to do that. So if you want to do that, just let me know, you know, and we can work out a day and time that fits both of our schedules, and we can just Zoom one-on-one, you know, if you want to, for a half hour, an hour additional, something like that. So I don't know, does that answer your question? Does that help? Because yeah, I could talk about this stuff for 3 hours, but there's a lot of reasons as to why I don't. Okay. So if you'd like, if you'd like to do a one-on-one Zoom meeting, please send me a Canvas message or an email. Give me some days and times during the week that work for your schedule, and we'll find one that works for both of us, and I'll send you a Zoom link and a password, and you and I can talk more about this stuff, because I'm always happy to talk about this, because, you know, this is what I do. Okay? Super. So anything else I can help you with this morning before we sign off? Okay, great. So you take care, be safe, be well, and I'm always here when you need me. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye.